Well, welcome, Carmen, to
Thank
Time
you.
Flies Quilt and Sews virtual quilt retreat,
Thank
which is
you.
called Will You Be My Valentine?
Perfect.
And it's the 10th of February, 2023. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about you and your business.
Okay. Well, it's I think we were just talking, I was kind of describing myself. I was a mom with 5 kids and thinking, what can I do? What can I do to earn a little extra money? And I definitely have a sewing background. I come from a big family. Our business is Ten Sisters Handicraft, and there are 10 sisters, and I only have 7 brothers. And so I come from this wacky big family, 1 mom, 1 dad, no twins. I am number 12. So to me, us getting together is like, that's like my favorite thing. My favorite thing is to hang out with my sisters. And so, I did not start out, thinking I was going to have my own little business. And I did start teaching, and I used to always laugh and say, well, my whole concept of teaching is I just need to be 1 step ahead of my students, one page ahead. And, but like I said, I love getting together and gathering. And so I think I would describe myself as a technique teacher. And, I'm not going to try to think of years, but many years ago, so in the late 90s, I became a freelance educator for Viking and Pfaff sewing machines. And I really was the one that got the education. At that time, I got to go to all these quilt shows and all these different events around the country. And I was like the sewing machine helper. And, but so I got to be in on these classes with these amazing, teachers, and Eleanor Burns and Pat Sloan, and just on and on. And it was not to mention getting to work with the other educators. I learned so much. And but as a teacher, I think I'm more of a technique teacher. I taught free motion quilting and machine applique. And but as a quilter, I've always been very drawn to these traditional quilts, and specifically a lot of these old quilts that we have, because they literally were hand pieced, just some of these great old patterns. And so as an educator, I was exposed to a lot of different products and a lot of different techniques and things out there. And so I knew that there was a fusible grid out there. And so what happened to me was, how I'm sure that we all do this, we've got our quilt magazines and quilt books, and we have our Post-it notes, in all the ones that we like. And I was looking, and I had, as an educator, getting to go to a bunch of quilt shows, I started taking pictures of some of these antique quilts in the antique quilt booth. Or I have a few books that were, the Pioneer gals and their quilts. And so I had my little Post-it notes and some of my pictures, and I was just looking through these pictures, and one real specific quilt was kind of the one. It's this quilt that's in my first book. And so I was looking at pictures of basically this same quilt pattern, going, how in the heck can I make this quilt? Because it's a pretty intricate pattern, and I don't want to hand piece it. And so then all of a sudden I realized, wait a second, I'm looking at a grid, because I'll show you the picture of a little bit bigger picture of the quilt, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. And so I'm looking at, basically this quilt. And what I'm seeing are these on-point set blocks that are connected by this black chain that is a square, right? So I could strip piece these blocks, but there was no way to sew the blocks together. So Anyway, I'm looking at this quilt going, wait a second, I'm looking at a grid. And then the next thought in my head was, somewhere in my sewing stuff, I have some fusible grid, and I'm digging through. And I mean, so long story short, that was what really started this whole thing. Was I just really, really wanted to make this quilt. And so then as a teacher, of course, and I started making this quilt, and I figured out a few things really fast that really made a big difference. There's a company called Quilt Smart. Most of you have probably seen their great Mondo bag at quilt shops or made it. I had taught Quilt Smart classes for years. I love their product. So I reached out to Quilt Smart and I said, I'm going to be doing something with this grid, but I need to, and because they had a fusible grid, watercolor grids from back when the watercolor quilts were really popular. I said, but I need to make some changes. Would you guys print for me? And they said yes. And so Ten Sisters Easy Piecing Grid was born. And so we're basically just piecing quilts. I like to say it's a traditional quilt in a non-traditional way. And so if it's okay, I'm just going to go right into my demo and kind of show you guys what we're doing. And I think my favorite thing is if I'm doing a class or a trunk show and you've never heard of Easy Piecing Grid. And then I guess it's even better if you have. And so Easy Piecing Grid and cut for just by way of explanation. Well, we'll get into supplies and stuff in a second here, but this is a fusible foundation. And I think what Pam said is some of you have already got it. And it is a lightweight iron-on foundation that we print a grid on. And we actually print this ourselves. Quilt Smart printed for us for about 1.5 years. And I told her, I said, I really want to go digital instead of silk screening. They silk screened for us, and the ink was kind of a brown ink, and it was a little bit blotchy. And anyway, so while they bet we couldn't have gotten started without them. And so we were researching these large format printers, and the printers just kept getting bigger and more expensive. But because we print from a big roll and we print and it goes onto another roll, we ended up printing on textile printers. So we've got 3 big textile printers. And so instead of printing beautiful textiles, we're printing a foundation for you to put your beautiful textiles on top of. And so we actually print this grid in panels. And so the one that we're working with today, for the most part, unless you've changed your size, is the 2-inch finished. So we label these by the finished size.
No, it's 1.5.
Oh, we're going to do 1.5. Okay. The one behind me, if you can kind of see, I've got my heart started behind me. I am piecing mine in the 2-inch finished. So it's going to be, I've got 2.5-inch squares, but here is the beauty. So we actually print in 4 different sizes. We start with 2-inch finished, and we go all the way down to a little 1/2-inch finish. So this is my little pin cushion here, is 1/2-inch finished. And hopefully you'll be at the trunk show tomorrow morning. I got a whole bunch of fun quilts to show you guys, and they are all going to be pieced the same way. Now, because we are piecing on this foundation, we're kind of changing how we look at putting this quilt together, because typically when you're making a quilt, we think about block by block, or we think about strip piecing, but we are doing this a little bit differently. And hopefully this will explain the pattern that you have for today's class. And so I'm going to show you this mosaic again. This is my demo is on this quilt, and this is like I said, the quilt that started everything. So because we're piecing on these panels, instead of thinking about block by block or strip piecing, we take the quilt and we just divide it up into sections. And each of these sections represent a panel. And so this quilt right here, we always tell you, this size quilt is a 20 panel project. Well, here's how big it will be if you're piecing with the 1, 1.5, or 2 inch finished. So our panels have the same number of squares on them. So that's why the 1 inch finished is the smallest, and then 1.5 is a little bit bigger. And I'm going to show you guys because you've got the 1.5. So this is one panel of the 2 inch finished. And it's going to be a little bit bigger than your 1.5 inch finish. But the beauty of that is that you can make any of these projects in any of these sizes. And really the best news of the day is that it's one set of sewing instructions, no matter what the quilt. And so in your package, you should have an easy piecing instruction page. And no matter what quilt you're making, whether it's a pin cushion or a king size quilt, the sewing instructions are exactly the same. I think that's my favorite part about it. People said, how come you get so many books written and you've got all these patterns on your website? And I said, hands down is because I don't have to write instructions. Because the instructions are the same no matter what the quilt. And so I love that. So like I said, every pattern, we call it a layout where you've got the quilt and then I've laid it out into sections that are represent the panels. Now, like you'll notice on this quilt right here, this quilt is calling for 10 panels. And so each of the panels are 9 by 14 squares. And so here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But the bottom, to make the quilt symmetrical, you're always going to look on the bottom. Do you see that's not a full panel? And then over at the side, that's not a full panel. So depending on the quilt, you're going to always look on the bottom and the right-hand side to see if you're going to be using a full panel. And I have a little, so the quilt that we're doing today is the Sweetheart. This is a 6-panel project. And so in the 2 inch finished, it's going to be 54 by 56 before borders. The 1.5 is going to be 41.5 by 42 before border. And then the 1 inch would be a 27 by 28 inch. And so isn't that fun? Now, I will say just real quick about the 1/2 inch finished. My husband said, at the top, could we have it say 1/2 inch finished for crazy people? No, but because all the panels are 9 by 14 squares, I did not want to make a panel, that was this big. So instead of 9 by 14, the 1/2 inch finished has 18 by 28 squares. And so if I was making a quilt in the 1/2 inch finished, I would do 4 panels would equal 1 panel of the 1/2 inch finished. I'm going to show you this one tomorrow. I made this quilt in the 1/2 inch finished, but 4 sections or 4 panels are going to equal 1 panel of the 1/2 inch finished. So that's just by way of explanation. And so, like I said, the Sweetheart quilt is, and we tell you how many squares you need to cut. We give you yardage, fingers crossed that my math is right. And then this is the layout. So you see that this is using 6 full panels. And so we've just taken that very pixelated, very scrappy project and just divided it up. And so I'm going to show you how we are doing that. If you don't remember anything else that I say today, before you start piecing, you want to make sure that the fusible side of your panel is up. And if you look at the top of the panel, we do numbers across the top and down the side. You've got the little logo here. The logo of Ten Sisters, they all actually kind of look like my sisters. And I'm just going to tell you really quick. It's Meredith, April, Noelle, Carolyn, Hillary, Miriam, Shelley, Carmen, Bridget, and Larissa. And they all kind of look like Hillary's the only one that wears glasses, and she's got glasses. Anyway, Well, now we all wear glasses, but that's another story. Anyway, so when you're looking at your panel, you'll see the logo across the top, and you'll see down at the bottom of the panel where it ends, we have a little dotted line with a tiny little pair of scissors that this is where you're cutting. So if you ever go to a shop that sells it off the bolt and they start measuring it by the yard, remember this is sold by the panel. And so you want to, and so if you have the bumpy or fusible side up, the numbers across the top and down the side are legible. We purposely did that. So on the smooth printed side, the numbers are backwards. So when the bumpy or fusible side is up, the numbers are legible, and then you can kind of feel it. Now, if you're quilting or piecing with friends, you want to reach over and make sure their panel is fusible side up. And I will give you just a little tip. I'm telling you, it's the second panel that gets you every time, because the first panel, you're very careful. We're making sure everything is right. And then it's like, woohoo, this is so much fun. And you whip out that second panel and you don't check if the so if that happens today, you get a star. If it happens to you, you're only going to try to iron this to your ironing board one time, everybody. Maybe twice in my case. No. And so you're going to have that fusible side up. If you are following a pattern, you are going to just find the section that you are working on. You're just going to find that section that you are working on, and you're going to just start laying out your squares. Now, one thing I want to point out is that because we're piecing one square at a time, you can fussy cut fabrics. You can do some really great designing with directional fabrics. But I will tell you, I think hands down, most people's favorite part about this is that you get to see it. You get to see what it looks like before you sew. Now, I don't know how many of you are going scrappy. You can see my background is very scrappy, low volume. I'm a little obsessed. I think what I'm obsessed with is buying fabric. And so I love being able to just use a ton. And so, but this heart is basically a 2-color quilt, right? It's your heart and it's your background. So I found the piecing goes pretty fast. Now, sometimes people will come to class and they will say, Carmen, now is this going to be faster than traditional piecing? And I always tell them it depends entirely on how decisive you are, because some people literally will take a full class on one panel, just auditioning fabrics, and that's okay. That's okay. And other people are like, boom, they've got this whole thing, done in an hour. But when you're laying out your squares, a couple things that I want you to notice. You can see a little bit on mine that I've got some wiggle room around these squares. And one of the reasons is because my cutting is not perfect. But the other is that when we print this foundation, we purposely print the squares slightly bigger than your cut size, about a 1/16 of an inch. And so you're going to cut the full 2 inch, you're going to cut the full 2.5 inch. And essentially what we are doing is we are giving you room to fold. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. And it makes a huge difference in your finished quilt top. Because we're piecing on this foundation, and we are fusing our squares to the foundation, it's staying in the quilt. We're not tearing this out. And so what we want to make sure is we have a really nice, soft, pliable quilt top in the end. So I'm going to talk to you about a few tips of how to make sure that happens. We actually pay extra for a product that is lightweight, but nice and strong. And so, but just giving you that room to fold is probably the biggest difference. When I was telling you that I had that fusible grid in my stash and I started making that first mosaic, well, I found out really quickly that because those squares were printed exactly 2 inches, I had fabric in my fold and my section was super bulky. And so I ended up trimming almost 1/8 of an inch off of every single square in that whole quilt. So I was like, okay, when I print my own grid, we're going to make those squares a tiny bit bigger. So we do that even on that 1/2 inch finished. So when you, after all these squares or where you want, you are going to give this a really,
Photobomb.
he can't help himself. That was Patrick. He's my cute husband, my right-hand man, but he likes to be known as the CEO of Ten Sisters Handicraft, and that stands for carry everything out. And he does a really good job at that.
Well, I know he has a sense of humor for the amount of times that he's answered the phone.
I know.
Nice
he
to
is-
meet you, Patrick.
Yeah, he's so funny. He can't stand it. I had to come and say hi. Okay, so when you have decided where you want all these squares and you're going to give this a really good pressing, you see how I don't have any squares lifting up, no corners lifting up. And so when we talk about pressing these squares down, my favorite way, let's see, I had something close. So my favorite way to piece my squares is I have a pressing board and I've got a big one here that's on my table. But it's a nice pressing board that you can make. And I do plain canvas on the top so I can see the grid, right? And so I'm going to lay my panel on. I'm going to have the fusible side up. And I'm going to just lay a section down. Actually, I'm going to tilt let me just tilt this down a little bit so you can see my table. Can you see that okay? And so what I like to do is I like to actually just start laying out a section of squares, and I love a travel size iron because then I'm just going to come in and I'm just going to, and I'm not trying to press these down necessarily permanently, but I'm keeping them so they stay fused on, because then once I decide on the whole panel, then I'm going to take it over to the big iron and then I'm going to give this a really good fusing so everything is really nice and secure. The other thing, sometimes we don't have access to the iron, or like when especially if I'm teaching at a quilt show, and in my book, we have the same picture in all the books, and we're showing an Elmer's washable glue stick. Now, the thing I do like about these glue sticks is they are starch based. And when I first started doing easy piecing grid, you could get these for like a nickel, and they're not a nickel anymore. And so I've loved switching to the Soline glue pen. I love these pens because you can refill the little ink cartridge. Now, I do actually prefer a white. When I first started doing this, there was no white that I could find. These were purple. The glue does, even like this blue pen, this does dry clear, but the Soline has a white glue. And so I prefer the white because then you're just not worried that it's showing through fabrics. But if I was doing something with like some dark batiks or whatever, I would not worry at all about this blue pen. But the Soline pens to me are a lot more economical than the glue sticks now, because they're not cheap anymore. Now, sometimes I'll have people in class and they'll have their grid down and they get their glue and they're like gluing the whole square down. And so really what we want to do is maybe just something in the middle, or a couple little lines down the side, a little circle, and just enough glue that you're just going to hold those squares in place. So gluing is an option. Some people love gluing their squares down and then just taking it over to the big iron. But if you've got a nice little pressing surface, then that's a really good way. Hello again. That's a really good way to do it too, because then you're eliminating the glue altogether. And so one thing I want you to notice is before I take it over to the big iron, notice that I've trimmed right up next to the fabric. I don't have extra grid on the outsides. To me, it just makes it way easier for the pressing part, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. But generally speaking, I'm going to just trim everything right next to the fabric. I'm going to go give this a really nice pressing. So these are nice and secure. And then you're just going to fold it on that fold line and sew your 1/4 inch seam. So no pins. And then just fold it on that fold line. Now, when I say the fold line, that's just a little dotted line that separates all the squares. I do like to do a little back stitch at the beginning and the end of my seam. Now, the other thing is, a couple things is that it doesn't matter if you're sewing your long seams first on your panel or your short seams. But if you're doing a project that has more than one panel, do the same direction first on all the panels. It's just going to make it a lot easier when you start putting the panels together. So always sew the short seams first, or always sew the long seams first. And of course, if it's a one panel project, then it doesn't matter. And so now your next step, after you've sewn your seams in one direction, this is that seam that you just sewed, okay? Sew that seam. Your next step is you are going to clip right between each of those squares, right up to the stitch line. Now, I love having some good little snippers, and you're just gonna, you can see the dotted line. It kind of defines that little area that you're clipping. Plus visually, you can see your space. Now, which brings me to a good point. You do not need to see a space between your squares when you iron them down. They can be butted right next to each other, but what you want to avoid is your squares overlapping, because what that means is you have fabric in your fold. Now, this kind of gets in, especially with half square triangles, where, maybe you get one that's a little on the small side. Well, then you want to center it. And then if you say, well, gosh, these, there's a pretty good sized gap right here. I will just admit right now that when I'm cutting out squares, I usually cut a few too many layers at one time. So sometimes my squares are not perfect. But you see, I've got a pretty good sized little gap right there between these two squares. Well, I'm going to fold this on the fold line, and then I'm going to double check. It's like, oh, that is actually going to fit just fine in my 1/4 inch seam allowance, because a fold actually takes up some room. And so, like I said, your fabric squares can be butted right next to each other. If there is a little gap before you say, oh, I can't use that square, just fold it and double check. Is that going to fit in your 1/4 inch seam allowance? So you're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the reason we do not print or mark the seam allowance is we all have a different 1/4 inch seam allowance, right? And so really the key is just having it be consistent. And so you are going to just clip between each of those squares right up to your stitch line. Now, if you happen to snip through the stitching, it's all held together by this foundation, so it's not going to shift or move. So don't worry if you happen to snip through the stitching. And so after, what I like to do is I sew through the whole panel, and then I go take this to Patrick, who's watching like a football game, and I give him my scissors and he'll sit there and snip. So you're going to snip through the whole panel. And then this pressing part, I think this is a huge step. And what you're going to do is you're going to press your seam allowances going in opposite directions. You see that? So this row is going to go this direction. The next row is doing that. And the reason you were doing this pressing is so that when we fold right sides together to sew the other way, you see how those are automatically nested perfectly. So there's no pinning, there's no adjusting. These are right where they're supposed to be. And then you're going to just sew your seams in that opposite direction. And then this is how they turn out. And so those corners, those points, those corners, those intersections are going to be perfect every single time. And so, like I said, that foundation stays in your quilt. And so the second seam, I just press in one direction. And so it should say this in the written instructions, but a big part of my pressing is bringing in the moisture. I love using steam. And the steam is not going to shift and move that fabric because we put it down on this nice foundation. And so if you don't have a good steam iron, then I really like the little mister bottles that you can give that some moisture. And what the steam does is it not only really helps the fabric adhere to the fusible, but it's going to keep this nice and soft. if I ever get an email or somebody will come up and they'll say, you know, I finished my quilt top and it feels really stiff. And I always ask them, did you use steam? And hands down, that is the biggest issue, because the dry iron is going to tighten up that foundation, you know, just because that's what we like about a dry iron. It tightens up our fabric. You know, we use a spray starch to stabilize our fabric, but when you put it on the foundation, you're stabilizing your fabric. And so you don't need to do spray starch. The only time I really use spray starch is when I'm making half square triangles. I like, you know, giving that fabric a little bit extra stability when I'm making half square triangles, but steam is going to make a huge difference. And you are going to really have a nice soft quilt top. And tomorrow, especially, I'll show you, I tend to be a real over quilter in my quilting. And a lot of my quilts, I quilt very densely and they quilt beautifully. I've had quite a few quilts done. I have a couple of friends who have computerized long arm machines. And, you know, so you can't avoid any thick spots with computerized, and they do great because they're not shifting and moving like a traditional pieced quilt would. And so your quilt top is really stable and flat. So for me, like I was talking about in the beginning, it was the ability to make some of these wonderful old quilt patterns. So my first book is called 10 Quilts for 10 Sisters. 4 of the quilts in that book were pictures of antique quilts that I had just been carrying around for ages. But I will tell you, as a piecer, what really intimidated me was patchwork, basically anything involving a half square triangle. And, you know, I spent a lot of time going, backing up a little further, going, yeah, I can live with that. Yeah, that's fine. And I honestly just did not really love the process of making the blocks, and they got to be the same size. And then what really drove me nuts is when you're adding sashing and a corner post and you got to get them all straight. And so we moved on to half square triangles. And so this, like I said at the beginning, I've got 10 sisters, I've got 7 brothers. So this is the 7 brothers block party. And each of the sisters got a quilt named for them. The brothers did not get that, but there's my brothers. And this is where I spent my whole life, was at the sink washing dishes. I couldn't believe it when I got married. I'm like, there's only 2 people that we wash dishes for. What in the heck? And so, but this book is all about traditional patchwork. And so there's some samplers inside, and then just, you know, just some other great quilts. We have done this exactly the same concept. You know, like I said, the instructions are the same. So this is the big sampler, and you see how it's divided into sections, and notice that the sashing is included in the piecing. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like. Oh, and then I'll show you this. Because we are breaking all these blocks down into squares and half square triangles, for each of the 2 samplers, we give you each individual block and just tell you how many squares and half square triangles are in each of those blocks. So I'm going to show you the panel. So this is, again, this is the 2-inch finish that I'm working on right now. But we had a quilt shop make this big sampler in the 1/2-inch finished. It kind of blew my mind. I'll do the 1-inch finished all day long, but anyway. And so this is the panel. And so do you see that this is just a section of this quilt? And so that we've got our blocks and we've got our sashing, and see the corner posts are in there. Notice that even my corner posts have a directional fabric. And so, like I said, we are breaking these blocks down into squares and half square triangles. And so you're going to pre-sew half square triangles using your favorite technique. Pam and I were saying how much we love that block lock ruler to get those half square triangles nice and squared up. A lot of great ways to make half square triangles. The whole trick, let me pull this up one more time. we're going to break these blocks down to squares and half square triangles. But the whole trick, let me just fold this up so we can, to getting those nice points, right? Because when we're piecing with half square triangles, it becomes all about those points. And the whole trick for getting great points every time is lining up the seam of the half square triangle from corner to corner. So on your foundation, every corner has that little extra little tick mark. And so what it means to me, once again, is that my cutting doesn't have to be perfect because that foundation is. So as long as they fit in the square and as long as they fit safely in your seam allowance, when you sew, you're just going to fold on that fold line and sew your seams, then they are going to turn out awesome every time. And so here's a finished section of this quilt. And I think my points turned out pretty great. But I got to tell you, I think I'm more excited about how straight my sashing is than I am how the points turn out. Sashing is hard. I think it's hard. And so then that foundation is staying in your quilt. You're going to just press that seam going the opposite direction. Now, one thing, so I guess I was teaching somewhere in the quilt shop makes t-shirts. And I told them in a trunk show, I said, we've taken the pinning out of patchwork, and they made me a t-shirt that says we've taken the pinning out of patchwork. But what I wanted to show you on the back of this panel. So this panel is done. This panel is done. And I don't know if you can see my seam. Let's see if you can see my little seam. So can you see my seam that I actually sewed these two panels together, right? So this panel was all sewn up. The next panel was all sewn up. And then I just put those right sides together. I did have to use pins, and I am just matching those up, and I just carefully sew them together. And so, which kind of brings me to another thing that we'll talk about. I'm going to stop talking in a minute and open this up to some questions, if that's all right with Pam. But I do like to fuse panels together. And so I've got some kind of, I've got lots of little tips and things. Like personally, I will go to great lengths to not pin. And so just like behind me, I've got one panel here all ironed down, and the next panel is all ironed down. And so I don't know if you can see this from here, but I've left a little lip of the foundation that's left over on the edge. I've left this little lip. And then on the next panel, I've trimmed it right next to the fabric. And so before I start to sew, I'm going to use a glue stick, or I'm going to use my iron, and I'm not going to match up my fabric squares because my cutting is not going to be perfect. I'm going to match up the foundation. I'm going to match up the little dotted lines that make up that grid, and I'm going to fuse these two panels together. Now I've just eliminated the pinning between these two panels. Now, one really important thing to know is that fusing panels together is just an option. I have a really great friend, and she teaches easy piecing grid. And in her classes, she makes them fuse the whole quilt top together before they sew. And I'm like, Heather, it's okay if they want to just sew up one panel at a time. She's like, yeah, but it's so much easier if they just fuse the whole thing together. Anyway, she is great. And so I always like to say fusing is just an option, because even if you had a 12 panel project, or even on this 6-panel project, if you just fused top and bottom, fused those two together, top and bottom, not side to side, well, you're going to eliminate half of the pinning on that whole quilt top. So once again, it's just an option. And after we have some questions, I'll give you a few other little fusing tips if you like. I just want to show you our Quilts for Kids has got 16 projects. And so what we did with this book was we did some fun little pixelated pictures, and the hedgehog is one of my favorites. These are all 6-panel projects, but there's lots of great quilts in this book. We did some bigger quilts, and then one of my very favorite scrap busters is in the kids book. And so they're not just all baby quilts, and they are divided up the exact same way, the same instruction. We have one other book, and for those of you that haven't, we'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow. This is our Around the Block quilt book. And this book, all the quilts in this book are designed using our border panels. And so I don't want to get off track in class today talking about border panels, but I'll show them tomorrow. They are long, narrow panels. And so we're doing quilts like medallion quilts, row quilts, the old wonderful pattern that I feel like I'm bringing back is this Boston Commons. And so we will show those tomorrow and talk about those tomorrow. And the last thing I wanted to tell you is that I think Pam sent out to you guys the 6-panel. It's showing it backwards, the writing I realize here. But these, you can order these on her website by these pre-cut, we call them pre-cut packs. So like here's 6 panels, it's backwards, sorry. 6 panels of the 1-inch finished, and it's 27 by 28 before borders. So we always tell you all.
It's not backwards, Carmen.
Oh, good. It's backwards for me, but you can read it.
Yeah, right.
I'm just backwards. Got it. And so like, here's the 12 panel 2-inch finished. It's going to finish 72 by 84 before borders. And so, we always tell you how big it is before, and she's also got them off the bolt. And so if you're making a project that's got an odd number, or let's say you want to make this 6-panel heart, but you want to make it more into a twin size. So you're just going to add some length to it on the top and the bottom. You're going to make it a little more scrappy. You're just going to add more panels. And so I love that. I feel like this just really brings out a lot of creativity. And so, because you're really only limited by your imagination and the picture. So I look at these layouts, and to me, they're just a suggestion for you. You know, what if you love that sampler quilt, but you just want to make a table runner? What if you on and on and on. What if you just want to do one block? I wanted to show you a couple. This is one of the patterns on our website, and this is a 1-panel. This is a 1-panel project, and of course we tell you how big it is and the different sizes. And so we have lots of patterns on the website that are either free or 99 cents. And maybe if you're really nice, Pam will make some of those patterns available to you. And endless possibilities. I think that's why I can't go to sleep some nights. And we're actually just finishing up the last quilt for book number 5, and it's called Heirloom Quilts, and it's all old quilts. And so I'm really excited about that book. So I want to just open it up for some questions and see if any of you have got any questions that I can answer. And then I have a few other little tips as you get on with the project too, that I want to bring up, but mostly I want to stop talking so you can get to work. But any questions out there?
First of all, somebody had typed in the chat, Barb Searing. Nice to see you on, Barb.
Thanks,
I
Barb.
have all of Carmen's books.
Awesome.
This one is the 7 Brothers Block Party.
Yep, 10 quilts in that book.
I love the kids book. And maybe
you.
what I'll do afterwards or sometime this evening, I can broadcast to everybody, is to go page by page to show you what's all in these books. Just
Fun.
like if you were here to look at these books yourself, to page through them. This is the one that I usually recommend for people to start with, is this one, because it's just got a good basic, really nice quilts.
Thank you. The good news about the 10 Sisters book is it's all squares. There are no half square triangles in that book. And so for instance, like if you wanted to, like this one we call the Irish 9, because it's a very traditional double Irish chain, but because we broke everything down into squares, we threw a little 9 patch in the middle where this would typically be a big piece of fabric. And so what if you just want to make a little table topper or a baby quilt, or what if you want to keep going? To me, this book is really versatile because you can make it smaller, you can keep going to make it bigger. And that there's just some great quilts in that book because, you know, I'm all about these old quilts. My favorite thing is when I finished that very first mosaic, and I was had a little booth at the Utah Quilt Guild, and I was just starting, and I had this mosaic done, and this lady that I've known for a long time, and she's just one of those quilters that is in a whole different level. She's amazing, and she walked into my little booth, and she didn't see me. She looked at my quilt. And she goes up close to the quilt, and she's standing back, and then she starts looking around and she sees me and she goes, "Did you make that quilt?" And then so many times we've had people come up and say, "Where did you get this old antique quilt?" So I don't know. It just does my heart good every time that comes up because, you know, total beginners are making these awesome quilts. So excuse me. So anyway, any questions for you girls that you're getting started? I mean, I see somebody ironing squares down on their panel. Good job. We're going to make
You can go ahead and unmute if you have a question to ask of Carmen.
I have a quick question. You were talking about fusing things down. Hi, I'm Barb.
Hi, Barb.
Nice to meet you. My question is, once you fuse them down and you hold it up and you say, "Nah, I don't like this.
Yeah.
I want to move this here." Is it
Yes.
a short question to a long statement is, can you refuse
Yeah, that's a
even
great
though
question.
you've already fused it down?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so you know, depending on your, you know, every fabric is going to react a little bit differently. And so sometimes it's going to just really, even if I just use my little travel iron, it's going to really fuse down. A lot of times it'll just peel up, you know, it'll just kind of peel off.
Do you need to, because I know with some fusibles, you have to pre-wash it in order to use it. Do you need to pre-wash with this fusible?
No,
Okay.
no. And I've washed several quilts. There's been literally zero shrinking. And so, yeah, this, the definition of this product that we print on is a non-woven fabric, and it is polyester. And so it is not gonna, if you want a quilt that has that crinkly look and you want to wash the quilt, it's going to work out great. It does just fine. And so what you're going to find is just handling the foundation, it gets softer and softer. In fact, on my demo piece, one of the reasons why sometimes I get a big space between my squares is because I've been demoing with it and it just starts to like stretch. That's why I get quilts done. So in answer to your question, typically the best thing to do is to warm it up with an iron and then it peels right up. And if you give it a little shot of steam, it's even better. And so, and then I always tell my students, this is how we unpick. We unpick with an iron, not a seam ripper. And so before I start sewing, I realize I cannot be my own quality control person because I look at the panel and say, "Good job, Carmen, that looks great." And I totally do not see the mistakes. So I have to have Patrick or somebody else come and look and they'll go, "Oh, that half square triangle's turned the wrong way." And so, yes, you're going to warm it up with the iron is the easiest way to peel that up and turn it. So
Perfect.
Yes, definitely can readjust. I've only seen this happen twice. And I think it was when we were at a quilt show and we were sharing a lot of irons. An iron got so hot, they put it on there and it just like melted the grid underneath. And I've never seen that happen except at a quilt show when we had about 10 irons plugged in. And so that really does not happen. I use a hot iron. And so that works great. But let's say you fused and unfused and fused and fused, and there's nothing left to fuse this poor little square back on. Just put a little bit of your glue stick and then heat set it down. That's the other thing, you know, because we're not just gluing and letting it go. This, if you do use like one of the glue pens, it is not going to gum up your needle because you're heat setting it with the iron. These are basically starch based. So it's kind of like you're just over starching when you use the glue pen, but you want to make sure that it's dry ironed. And don't be alarmed if when you're ironing, the glue kind of reappears, because that heat is just making some moisture and it kind of makes the glue show up. And so one other little thing is if you are using a really light fabric and you've got a glue pen, instead of putting a blob in the middle, you know, to glue it, I'll put it in the seam allowance, just a little line. And so if, especially like if I have no print and it's just a plain pretty light yellow or something, I'll do a glue line in the seam allowance and then fuse the square down if you're using a glue pen. Oh, way too long of an answer.
That's
I
fine,
have
but thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This is Tammy George, and
Hi,
I
Tammy.
have a question. Will you mute that one over there, Betty? Just 1 second. I got two computers going here. I'm going to mute the other one.
Look at us doing technology. It is so great.
Okay. That should be better. We've used the panels and made a couple big projects,
Good.
and occasionally we'll have, I made a panel, well, maybe I can make you see it in the background, that UP on the back wall. I don't know if you can see it.
No, I can't see
Get
everybody that
closer.
is on here. And so I don't think I see everybody that's on here.
But anyway, the problem I've had and I had with this project is that the adhesive didn't stick. Like when I took it to
Oh.
the machine, several of my squares fell off.
Go off. Yeah. And
Now I
so-
used parchment paper when I ironed.
Oh, good point, which I actually didn't even bring that up. So if you notice when I was demoing, I put my iron right on top of the squares.
Yeah.
But that sometimes people do not like, and what I feel like is my fabric is here and the foundation is here. So even if there's a little gap, I just don't feel like I'm getting anything on my iron. And this is
I
off, by
definitely
the
felt
way.
like I was on the edges.
You always
Like if
see
I
that,
left that
yeah.
edge.
Yeah, very good point. And so if I'm really pressing it down to take to the sewing machine, I want to trim right next to the edge, because then I
Which
can
is
put the
what I
iron
did.
right on the edge. But if you want to use an applique pressing sheet or parchment paper, give it a little spray with the mister bottle. And then you put the applique pressing sheet or parchment over the top, and it's going to generate a little bit of moisture. The other thing,
So
that you can-
steam is the best for adherence?
yes, definitely.
Okay.
The other thing that you
That's-
can do, you know, once these are, you know, basically the squares are not falling off, right? You've got it,
Mhm.
you can turn it over to the back side. And when you're putting it over on the back side, you can do some pretty good, you can do some gliding if you have steam, or you just gonna hold. And so that's why I use a hot iron. This iron's off, by the way, everybody. That's why I'm pressing against my
Yeah.
chest here. You're not trying this at home. And so I use a hot iron, and I am hold 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I was holding a long time, but I was
Okay,
using
good.
parchment paper
Yeah.
and no steam.
And no steam.
So-
And so just do a little, just use like one of these nice little mister bottles and give it a little mist. And that's just going to generate a little bit of steam. And, you know, different fabrics. Did you find it with all your fabrics, or just like every now and then you had a
All
few
the
that weren't sticking?
Yeah, it was all the fabrics. It wasn't
Okay.
just one of them, but
Okay.
I had
Right.
several panels where I think I turned my iron a little hotter and I didn't lose any of them.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
really wasn't sure what to do, but I think steam and no parchment paper is probably the answer.
Yeah, and then you do want to be very aware of what is fusible. And so, but I have my irons on the hottest setting when I'm pressing,
Yeah.
and it just works great and just hold. And then, but some fabrics, if they've got a little sizing in them or different fabrics. One thing I was working on a batik project. And I don't know what it was, but that batik like melded into the foundation. I mean, I was steaming. I was trying to change my mind on a square, and it was like, holy cow, this is so fused. And then I'll have another fabric, that acts a different way. So, but yeah, steam is definitely your friend to get these fused down in a nice hot iron.
Okay, thank you so much. We got really frustrated.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I know. That's the worst. That's the worst if they're not sticking. But yeah, they should do, I will have a demo piece that I will demo 3 or 4 days at a quilt show. And I'll start to have a few little corners pull up, but they're fused, pretty darn good.
I'm just gonna show you the large one we did. I don't know if you can see it.
Let me see if this will let me.
Here, I'll spotlight her.
Oh, thank you.
There she is.
That's
Oh,
so cool.
wow. Oh, that is so cool.
And
That is awesome.
and that one I had several panels where I lost squares, but like I said, I
Oh,
did not use steam at
parchment.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's good. It's there's just, my website is tensisters.com. It's printed right on your pattern. But one thing I will tell you, because we are so new, we sell on our website, these pre-cut packages, and we go to a few quilt shows. I used to go to a lot of them. I don't go to that many anymore, but we never discount. We don't ever discount on our website, and we don't ever discount if we do a booth, because we want you to buy it from your shop. We want to support these local shops, and I want to retire someday. So I want to be totally wholesale. And my whole people say, Carmen, you're a genius. I said, no, actually, I'm really lazy. I want to stop working. But on the website, we've got, on the tutorial tab, we've got YouTube videos. And I literally this afternoon after class, I'm getting my space set up again to start getting some more YouTube videos filmed. And so we've got YouTube videos that kind of walk you through the process, and we're getting ready to do a bunch more. So you don't have to remember anything that I say, basically, is what I'm saying. Right? Any other questions out there? All right, I am going to, I've been almost an hour, but I do want to show you just a couple other options for if you want to fuse. Now, remember, that's just an option. You can just sew up one panel at a time. But especially if I'm working with the smaller panels, to me, it's like, it makes a lot of sense to fuse these together. And so, and I was also going to show you, this is what I do when I'm going scrappy. I love these lids to the office boxes, and I always cut out way more fabric than I need. And so I have all these drawers with stacks of squares. When my kid, 100 years from now, I'm going to live to about 195 just to finish all the projects that I have. But they're going to go through my sewing room and go, what is with all these drawers of squares? Oh my gosh. And so, but I want to talk a little bit, I was telling you that if you do want to fuse panels together, I leave a little lip. Well, let's say there was no lip left, or I forgot and I trimmed it. You can just cut a little strip, about a 1-inch strip. We show this on one of the videos, and you will just fuse half of it to the one panel to give you a little lip so that you can match these two up. Well, these are the 2-inch finished panels. So these are big panels. And so if I wanted to fuse these two together, well, now I have even a bigger piece to manage. you know, basically whatever size you want to manage, there's no pinning, but there are a few other little tips. This is the mosaic again, in the 1 inch finished. The one I was demoing before is the 1.5. But what I wanted to show you is this is a several of the 1 inch finished panels. And notice that I have sewn all my short seam. These are actually the long seams. I've sewn the vertical seams and I've done all my clipping, right? So I can do my pressing. And then what I like to call it is after I've sewn the seam, then the seam is closed. Does that make sense? So once the seam is sewn, that seam is closed. Well, on the edges, because I've sewn the seams this way, this seam is still open. See, I got to iron that guy down. You see how these seams are open because I have not sewn these horizontal seams yet. So what I did on this, and I'm going to show you on the back, if you can see it. Can you see my little, oh, let's see if I can get a good angle. Can you kind of see a little, I've got the little tab there where I fused these two panels together. Well, because I sewed because I sewed the vertical seams, it shrunk the panel in and shrunk the panel in. So now these are a little bit more manageable. And then I'm going to fuse these two together. So now it's fused together. So now I'm going to just put right sides together and sew that seam. It's a tiny bit more bulky because it's got that little extra grid, but I'm going to sew that seam and clip. And now I know that those seams are going to match up perfectly because I am not pinning, I'm fusing and clipping. Now I'm going to bend my camera down and show you one other thing about the pressing part. Can you see that okay? So one thing I wanted to say about the pressing, and I'm going to show you on this little small piece. Well, I'll just show you on this big one for now because I've got it here. And so what I'm going to do, of course, this is, I'm going to definitely use steam. This seam is not sewn yet right here, by the way. That's going to need to be sewn and clipped. But just pretend that's already sewn up and clipped. So all these seams are clipped to the stitching line. I am not going to use my travel iron. I'm going to take it over to my big iron. I've got lots of good steam and it's nice and hot. And I'm going to press all these seams of the top row in one direction. And then I'm going to just fold it under. And then I'm just going to back up with steam and I'm going to press this seam going the opposite direction and fold it under. So you're always just pressing one row at a time. Every now and then I do have to look and make sure that I'm not pressing two rows to get in the same direction. I'm sure you would never do this, but I have done this. And then so once all these seams are pressed in opposite directions on the back. Now see, if I've got this big, huge, long piece, I'm going to be pressing the row, slide down, pressing the row, turning it, or folding that under. Now I'm right-handed, so I like to go left to right. So you can turn the whole thing around. And after you folded that row under, then I'm still going to go right to left, if that makes sense. Or you can just back up and go backwards, either way. And then after, I'm going to show you on my other small piece here. After you've done your clipping and pressing, now I just have a few rows pressed here on this one. And so I've just got a few little rows, but see how I pressed this in one direction, folding it under, pressing in the next direction. And don't fold them up like, you know, in a stack. Just fold it all the way back. So that's just nice and flat. And you're going to press the opposite direction. After I've done this through the whole panel or the whole section I'm working on, then this is also really important. I turn it over to the right side, again using steam, and I press it out nice and flat from the front, because it's really easy to get these little folds in here, you know, where they're just not nice and flat. And now I'll tell you one thing, when you're working with just squares, you can get away with so much. And those intersections are just going to be perfect every time. But when you're working with half square triangles, it's all about those points. So you're going to be a little more careful with consistent seam allowances. And then also making sure that it's nice and flat from the front. And so it just eliminates that little extra fold in there. This is going to be nice and flat. So then when you do fold right sides together, you're going to have that dotted line on the fold. Those are going to be automatically all nested beautifully. And you're just going to sew that other direction. And then once again, using steam, nice hot iron, you're just going to press all those seams in one direction. Now, if this was a panel that I finished sewing and I sewed all my seams in one direction, after I get this panel, the next panel sewn, I'm going to press the seams in the opposite direction, right? Because if I do need to pin these two together, then the seams are going to go in opposite directions so that they'll nest when you sew. That makes sense. So if you are going to be pinning the panels after you've sewn them, I just double check on the second seam. I see, okay, this one I press this way. Now check, this one needs to be pinned. So which way do I want to sew the second seam? And that way they will nest together when you sew the panels together. That makes sense. I hope so. How do you feel about going forward? Have I talked you out of the whole thing, or you think you're going to be?
No, I think it's great. I could take my laptop and show some of the panels that we've done, or we can bring some of our
Fun.
Christmas ones that we did just to give the folks
Yeah.
an example of doing the same pattern on different size grids.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Tomorrow morning, I'll be showing a couple of samples of that very thing, you know, the same project, just different size squares.
Right.
So my only disclaimer to all of you, if you are new to this, this can be a little addicting sewing this way. So
Yes.
I cannot be personally responsible for what might happen.
All right.
Carmen, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What do you find is the easiest way to cut your squares? Do you use
Mm.
stripology ruler, or what do you
Yes.
use?
Yeah, I do. I love my stripology ruler.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
know, I think it's like my Swedish blood or something. I can't stand wasting anything. And but some people love the die cutting machines like the AccuCutter. And that is a great way to do it. But the stripology, I love this ruler. And I'll tell you that on some of these, you know, most of my quilts are scrappy quilts, and I never thought I would be making, you know, 1/2 inch projects, or even the 1 inch finished. So even 1.5 inch squares. So I'm going to show you my bag of scraps. So when I'm cutting at my table, this is what I end up with. Now it's full again. And so anything that is a scrap, I save, but the great big stripology ruler is for yardage or at least bigger pieces. And so I got their little mini one. And this has got the same slits every 1/2 inch. And so when I'm cutting up all these little scraps into 1 and 1.5 inch squares for most of them, I use the stripology mini, and I love it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that. And but you know, you can cut out a lot of squares pretty fast, you know. And that's why a lot of people love the 2 inch finish, because it's 2.5 inch squares. And so, you know, you grab a jelly roll and you just have to cut once, and you have all your 2.5 inch squares. And so, but you know, if you've always wanted to try that true postage stamp project, I'll tell you, this is the way to do it. It's just so fun. To me, it's fun for a lot of different reasons, but I think everybody's favorite is you get to see it. I think as quilters, we are very visual, and this just becomes a very visual process. So yeah.
Yeah, that's what got me. I made the red and white Scandinavian.
Yes.
I'm finished.
I
I'm not
love it.
finished, but I'm finished.
Oh,
And
see,
I
that's-
couldn't wait to finish that project, and it was so fun to do, and it was so easy to do because I didn't have to think at the end of the day.
yes, yeah. And
But
yeah. Oh, I love that tree out of the 1-inch.
yeah,
Oh,
so this was done with a jelly roll. And then we have some red and white Kimberbell fabric with the
cute,
little tiny red dots. This is
cute.
the top part of it. And
Yep,
you can see how it's nicely
Beautiful.
pressed
beautiful.
on the
beautiful.
back. So this is the bottom part. So Connie, will you hold this part above it?
So it's a
You
two-panel
can see
project.
how
It
much
does,
it shrinks. Yeah.
yeah, the
So we
smaller
did-
the square, right?
Yeah, and I have the 1/2 inch at home, and I just don't have enough time in the day to do
I
it.
know, right? I know, I get it. Oh, that turned out so cute. So cute. And see what a nice job you did those half square triangles with those corners going from, or those half square triangles with the
This
seam
one,
corner to
this one we
corner.
Jess's, yep.
Yep, look at those pretty, pretty points. Beautiful.
Yeah,
Did we
This is-
mention no
this is-
pinning?
yeah, no pinning. And then the big one, here's the finishes up at 2 inches.
2-inch pin. Oh, isn't that awesome?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's been fun to show this to people. And it kind of makes them, it teaches them. Yeah, Connie's not known for her precision, but, and that's very satisfying for everybody to look at.
Yeah, isn't that so fun? I know. I love that. You know, where the sewing is the easiest part. But the
Yeah.
other thing I love is just like on this project that I was demoing, when I lay this out, I know exactly where I left off.
And it's fun. I agree. It's really fun to see your quilt before it's done.
Yeah.
So now I'm gonna walk over. I'm in my classroom right now.
Oh, fun. That is so fun to see it.
Yeah.
Oh,
and-
beautiful classroom.
Yeah, and there's like our main showroom with,
Oh, wow. With your long arm and oh, wow. That's wonderful.
and now I've walked into our rear where it's
Ooh,
all
ooh,
fabric.
you've got that big cutting machine.
Yeah, we do.
Ooh.
And then right behind
Oh,
me,
there's
whoop,
the
there it is.
Scandinavia. Oh, that is gorgeous.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
that,
that's called Scandinavia.
uh-huh.
Yeah, I couldn't wait to get that done. I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna put borders on it or
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
but Patrick told me, he said, you should have done a 1-panel project for your first one. But no, I jumped into a 12-panel.
I love it. I love it. You know, that actually brings up a good point because when you have a finished quilt top, you know, whether it's a 1 or 2 panel project or a big quilt, and you want to add extra border, you treat this just like a regular quilt top. You don't need
Yep.
to stabilize the border. You know, sometimes I'll do a framing border and then I'll do a little an extra scrappy border with the grid. And so once you get all your layers on there with your batting, you just treat this like a regular quilt top and
Yeah,
it's pretty great. It's
Yeah.
pretty fun. Did I
So
mention
does
it? A little addicting?
yes, very much so. Very much so. So we do have all of the stripology rulers.
Awesome.
We do have the Sew Line glue
Oh,
pen.
super.
We love the Karen K. Buckley scissors for
Yeah.
the snipping.
Yep.
Yep.
Do you have the orange or the blue?
We have the blue.
Yeah, they're awesome. These are great. They just have that micro serrated where it just grabs it and it just snips right to that point every time. I love them.
Right. Yeah, tonight at 6:30, I'm gonna go through all the different scissors and
Oh,
what makes them
good.
different. Yeah,
Good. That's good to know. I'm definitely a scissor junkie. I love them all, but those Karen K. Buckleys are awesome. And they're very affordable. That's the other thing that I love about them and their nice little grip. I love that little soft grip.
right. I was gonna say, if we do sell out, so everybody's got a coupon code.
Oh, right,
Um,
right.
So I believe all of this stuff is gonna go at a really good discount.
That's
If we
awesome.
sell out, I will be placing an order afterwards. So if you get to check out and something that you wanted is gone, just send me an email and we'll create a list for whatever it is that you might need.
That's awesome. And you know, because we are the manufacturers, we try to be ready to ship right away. Gets a little hairy sometimes. And so I don't know if I'll be showing this quilt tomorrow, but there's a wonderful free pattern on tildasworld.com. Have you seen that Tilda's quilt, Pam?
Yes, I love all of those Tilda pixelated flower ones.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're doing another one, and so we are printing long hours because a lot of people are using Easy Piecing Grid to make that quilt. And I'll show
Right.
you the one. I have the embroidery flower tomorrow. And
Right.
but you know, we had when we were first starting, we were at a quilt show, and a lady, you know, we were showing the kids book. We had the kids book was just done, and she came up and she said, "Have you got an alpaca?" I was like, "No, I have a giraffe. I don't have an alpaca." But I said, "Let's Google, get your phone." And we Googled pixelated alpaca, and like, bring, all these pixelated pictures came up. And we found this really cool picture, and the blanket on the alpaca was like so cool and all pixelated. And so we've had people do army tanks and mermaids and, movie star faces and landscapes. You
Right.
just take your pixelated picture and you just divide it into sections that are the size of your panel, and you just create your own layout, so.
Yeah. And you
it-
can use a lot of the gradient fabrics out
Yeah,
there to get the
yes.
proper tones that you're looking for. So,
Yes.
oh yeah,
What I really hope is that this helps you look at quilts in a little bit different way. Because I don't know if you're like me, but I would see a quilt, whether it was some real intricate sampler or, these older patterns, and I would just be like, nah, I love that quilt, but I don't think I'd ever make that quilt. And I think my number one comment is, oh my gosh, I could do that. I could do that. And then you start thinking about, I have this block of the month that I started, 5 years ago, and it was all 2.5-inch squares. And it's like, can I piece that on your stuff? And anyway, so, I hope it just kind of helps you think a little bit more in possibilities, and, look at some of the patterns that you have or kits that you might have. And if it can be turned into a grid, then
yes.
you can piece it this way.
Carmen, I was thinking I have an app, and it's like a photo app where
Yeah.
you can do like make somebody look like a watercolor painting or an oil painting, but there's also a pixelated
Yes.
one too.
Yeah.
So,
There's several free apps, and my grandkids I have a couple of them on my phone, and they will pixelate, pictures. But there are some free or websites that will pixelate a picture for free in like 2 minutes. And I think one of them is called pixelart.com. I don't remember the names, but if you just do like free pixelating websites, my daughter and I both are big Audrey Hepburn fans. And so on my to-do list, I pixelated 2 pictures of Audrey Hepburn's face. But you upload a picture, and then you say how many colors you want in it. You say how many squares across you want it. And it's like, ding, in like 5 seconds, it's pixelated, and you go, I need more color, or I need fewer squares. And it's really cool. So my son-in-law started doing all these like artwork, these kind of famous artwork, and he was pixelating them, and I'm just like, oh, stop giving me ideas. This is blowing my mind. Anyway, sky's the limit. That's the bottom line. Sky's the limit. And and I also like it when it is part of the quilt. I think it was the what are they? Camille, what's her name? Thimble Blossoms, is that the
Yeah.
Hilda?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think they did this darling pattern a few years ago that was a great big star, and they had all these scrappy 1-inch finished sections of this star. And so we've had a lot of people just piece that section on the grid and then do the rest of the pattern. You know,
Oh.
Primitive Gatherings has some amazing, you know, patterns with little tiny squares. And so anyway, I got to stop talking about it because
No, that's cool.
endless possibilities is the
Yeah.
bottom line. So I hope that if you girls need any extra help or tips, my email is on the pattern. And like I said, the website's got lots of videos. There is also a gallery page that lets you see pretty much most, if not all of the quilts in each book. If you were, you know, like, what are the quilts in the book? You can look at
Oh.
the gallery page, but it'd be really fun for you to show too. Because
Yeah.
the nice thing about showing it in the book is you see the layout and it's like, oh, it's 6 panels, or, oh, you know, oh, this is a 24 panel quilt. I don't want to make 24 panels. So you're just basically going to stop ironing squares whenever you're done. So tons of possibilities.
Well, that's just incredibly awesome. We have enjoyed it, and I hope everybody else catches the 10 Sisters Easy Piecing Grid panel fever.
I know. Oh, it's super fun. Well, thanks so much for letting me join your retreat. I hope you gals have a great time. Thanks, Holly, and yeah,
Thank you.
Andrew, all these, Carol, all these fun gals sewing. So anyway, you guys have a great time, and we'll see you tomorrow for the trunk show.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks so much,
Thanks.
Pam.
You're welcome. Thank
right.
you.
Don't stay up
Bye-bye.
too late sewing, everybody.